Brent, can I get a sound check?
Yep, you're good.
No, that's not good. Shoot. Hello, hello.
Hello, Ed. Well, I hope maybe no one can hear.
Hey, hi everybody. Welcome. We're going live. So welcome very much to our discussion here on support for journalism as a business. It's pretty newsworthy topic these days, I would say, given the general cut and thrust of the industry. My name is Brent Jolly. I'm the president of the CAJ, and I'm here to be the moderator for this session. I'm just going to explain for everyone who's joining a couple of the ground rules before we get started. So what we're going to do, we have a panel of 5 excellent people here, one who will be joining us very shortly. They are going to be opening up with a brief, my apologies, with a brief 3 to 5 minute opening statement, which is completely free for them to, take in the direction they would like. And from there, we will also then go to a response period for 5 minutes, so that everybody can have a chance to respond to, as it sort of says, based on what they hear from others and where things would like to go. And following that, we'll be doing plenty of time for moderated questions from myself. I have some prepared, and also audience questions. So I want to make sure that we have lots of time for that. So if I could just start off, we've done a little preview in terms of picking names and who's going to go first. The winner of that contest was Mr. John Hondrick, who's here. And he's a businessman and the former publisher of the Toronto Star. And he was in that role from 1994 until 2004. He's both a member of the Order of Ontario and the Order of Canada. And last year was named the Lifetime Award recipient from the Canadian Journalism Foundation. Next up, we'll be speaking is Colette Brun from the Université Laval's Department of Information et Communication. And she's also the director from the Centre d'études sur les médias. She's the coordinator and coordinates the Canadian portion of the Reuters Institute for the Study of Journalism's digital report. And she's also the chair of the Canada Revenue Agency's Independent Advisory Board on the eligibility for journalism tax measures and that. So that's very timely as well. Third up is Emma Gilchrist, who's a reporter, editor, and public speaker who co-founded the Narwhal in 2018. She's worked both in Canada and the United Kingdom as a journalist, and has a journalism degree also from Mount Royal University in Calgary. Next up, we have Ed Greenspon, who is the president and CEO of the Public Policy Forum. And he's also the editor-at-large in Canada for Bloomberg News. He's a former editor-in-chief of the Globe and Mail, and sort of the Carleton connection. He was formerly on the board of governors of the university from 2010 to 2016. Also joining us momentarily, I hope, will be Kevin Chan, who's the global director and head of public policy in Canada for Facebook. So that means he's involved with interfacing with publishers, policymakers, and all that sort of stuff, those actors, about Facebook's products and services and those kind of things. He also talks about, specializes in election integrity, misinformation, and freedom of expression. So, John, seeing as though you're first, I think the floor is yours now.
Thank you very much, Brent. I see you introduced me as a businessman. I think I bring 1 or 2 journalistic credentials to the discussion. But I guess my input today, I will start out our general topic in terms of the impact of the pandemic on journalism, just to give the audience some hard facts on exactly how it's affected the company. Until very recently, I was involved with Torstar. Can you hear me?
Yeah, sorry, John. That's just, I think that's Kevin saying that he's a little behind schedule. So hopefully he'll be joining us momentarily.
All right. So what I can do is just, I think for purposes of discussion, just give you an idea of what the pandemic, what impact it's had economically and also on subscriptions. First of all, at Torstar, when for the first month or two of the pandemic, I can report that advertising revenues at Torstar were down between 65 and 80% every day, year over year. That was the highest level it was at. I can tell you we received quite a few public service announcement advertising from the government. In fact, at that point, I can say government stepped up all three levels in the case of the Star, both the city, the province, and the feds, with a significant support of public service journalism, information on COVID, etc., which had an impact. But as time has gone on up until August, advertising, in fact, has come back slightly. I can tell you when they, for example, opened garden centers, all of a sudden we got garden center advertising. But for the most part, we're still looking at declines of over 50% year over year in advertising revenue. It's getting a little bit better now, but still at those levels. So for a business whose business model was already somewhat broken, this has been quite a catastrophic hit. Interesting that the government's support program to pay 75% of wages for the employees of those companies whose revenues declined 35%. I can tell you that Torstar did qualify for that relief, but I know the Globe and Mail didn't, and I don't think the National Post did as well. Very interesting, and this reflects, quite frankly, the new dynamic about newspapers today. 7 or 8 years ago, I could tell you 80% of our revenue came from advertising, 20% came from circulation and or subscriptions. Those numbers have not quite reversed, but we've now got to a point where subscription revenues, in fact, are the majority of our revenue. So for a paper like the Globe and Mail, whose subscriptions are even higher, they didn't suffer a decline at all. They just suffered a decline in its advertising portion, but that wasn't enough to get it up to the 35% threshold. I can tell you from the point of view of the Star, Torstar, the only way we were eligible for that relief was that we were able, as a company, we were able to include all our community papers under Metroland. There are about 80 of them. And obviously, there's no subscription revenue there because they're given away free. So the decline was 80%, and it was huge. But only on that basis were we able to qualify. I might also add, just as a point of reference for the newspaper groups in Ontario, the now defunct Ontario Digital Media Tax Credit, which the Ontario government brought in about a decade ago. It was meant to support the gaming industry, but newspapers were able to qualify. I can say this has been a lifesaver for the newspaper groups in Ontario. In the case of Torstar, we received 85 million from that subsidy. On the subscription side of the business, I can tell you that the pandemic has been very good for business. There has been a huge public interest in reading about it for all the obvious reasons. And I think the criteria that we as established media outlets bring, that you can get good, honest, edited information in a reliable way, has definitely played to our significant advantage. We've seen a significant increase in subscriptions. I might say we were the first outlet in Canada to, in fact, put some of the stories outside the paywall in the interests of the public. But obviously we've had much more success. I would also say that this is really a story in which local is the key. And when we were able to actually come up with an infographic which allowed you to go down to a specific neighborhood in the Greater Toronto Area to find out what the risks were, how it was going. There was absolutely huge interest. That did extremely well. My time's almost up. So I would say overall, from the pandemic, subscriptions are up, advertising is down dramatically. We're going to discuss the whole issue of government aid. All I can say, and we have Ed Greenspan, he can echo these comments, this discussion about providing aid to some of the big media companies, it's been going on for 5 years. And I can report that as of this very moment, we have not received 1 cent from any of those programs. Look forward to the discussion. Thank you.
Thanks very much, John. That's a sobering thought. We'll definitely be picking up on that in the discussion. Colette, please, the floor is yours.
Thanks. Well, it's interesting that John mentioned the additional public advertising from governments, which was actually a source of support during the pandemic, although these programs are perhaps more complex to execute and to administer. So that's also worth considering. And I'm maybe shooting myself in the foot because I'm actually part of that process. But I just wanted to say a few words just in completing what John just said about the impact on the media economy. What John described, I think, focused on the Toronto Star and on newspapers specifically, and more largely, I would say, based on a report that the Centre d'études put out last week on Quebec, but with some data from Canada as well. The first wave really hit the whole media industry very hard. The publicly traded companies reported advertising losses of about 30% in the second quarter compared to 2019. And based on the information we have, of course, the daily newspapers were the hardest hit, and they were already the hardest hit by the funding crisis. So you could say that it kind of accelerated a process that was already in place, and it raises questions about the ability of our news ecosystems, which are already fragile, to resist this kind of a crisis. If there's a larger economic slowdown, it's going to impact media directly. So that's the impact on the business itself. But actually, the question was about the debate on support for journalism as a business. So support for journalism as a business, I assume we're talking not just about government aid, but also just even consumer support. Are people willing to pay for news? Before even the pandemic hit, we did this year's survey for the Digital News Report with the Reuters Institute, and we found that Canadians were actually starting to pay there's more Canadians who are paying for news subscriptions and for news online in different forms. So that's certainly encouraging. And what John just said suggests that in some cases, perhaps not for all publications, but there's been a willingness of Canadians to actually spend on news in the context of the pandemic. I think it's hard to say how much the pandemic impacts the public's perceptions of the news as a business. I think people have a lot of other issues on their mind right now, but certainly people have been more attentive to news, certainly aware of the importance of having up-to-date local quality news on the pandemic itself and on different aspects of confinement. As we're all kind of grounded in our community and geographically, we realize how important it is to know what's happening around us, I think, but that's not a scientific fact. It's more of an impression. Just this morning, there was a story in the Devoir. Radio-Canada's ombudsman says that the number of complaints to Radio-Canada about Radio-Canada news coverage has gone up 40% in the last year. So you could see that as a glass 40% full or 40% empty, I guess. But in a sense, you can see it as people being more attentive to news and more critical of news. So in that sense, you can see it as a good thing. And of course, there are some very vocal groups I think, that do not represent the population as a whole, who are very critical of government support for newsrooms. And that kind of ties into some of the very vocal critiques of how the government is managing the pandemic. We certainly hear a lot about them in Quebec. I'm not sure how representative they are of public opinion. I think they're a very small minority, but we do hear about them quite a bit. And we know that from survey research on trust that attitudes towards media tend to follow attitudes towards governments and institutions in general. So if there's a surge in trust in governments, as we've seen in the pandemic, of course, there is a surge in trust in media that follows. And that might be something positive, but I'm not sure how much of that is permanent or will last beyond the first wave. And I just wanted to end with a last note on consumption and, having been confined at home for long periods of time, people are maybe spending more time following the news. But one of the mental health recommendations is actually to follow less news. So perhaps that could be a little less, a little more negative for the news industry. So I'll keep it at that for now.
For sure. Thank you, Colette. Everything in moderation. That's good. Emma, please.
Hi, it's a pleasure to be here today, as in here, my house in Victoria, and virtually with you all at Carleton. So I'm the co-founder and executive director of The Narwhal. The Narwhal is an online magazine that does in-depth and investigative journalism about Canada's natural world. We're mostly focused in Western and Northern Canada right now, and we're really pioneering a new model for journalism, a new business model. So we don't run any advertising and we don't have a paywall, and yet our largest source of revenue is our readers. We're also a nonprofit, one of Canada's very few news organizations that is structured as a nonprofit. And so, the pandemic, in terms of its impact on us, traffic throughout the pandemic has been up at most news outlets, and that was certainly the case for us as well. In March, our traffic was up about 140% over March of the previous year. That was followed also for many publishers by a sort of COVID fatigue, if you will, this summer, when a lot of publishers saw their traffic drop off to, more sort of normal levels, and we saw that as well. But since our largest source of funding is our readers, the pandemic hasn't had the type of negative effect on our business model as it has on the more traditional business models. In fact, in the first 6 weeks of the pandemic, we ran our most successful membership drive ever, and our membership grew by about 45% in those first 6 weeks. We reached our year-end membership goal 6 months ahead of schedule. So more traffic equals, more readers, more engaged readers, more newsletter subscribers, more members for us. So in terms of our business model, the pandemic has not necessarily been a bad thing. In terms of the larger support, for government measures to support journalism, for instance, I think it's going to be interesting to see how that plays out. We did become a qualifying Canadian journalism organization about a month ago, I believe. We got the call from CRA. So that will qualify us for the Canadian Journalism Labor Tax Credit moving forward. And we've also applied for registered journalism organization status, which we hope to be one of the first in the country to attain that because of our nonprofit model. And that measure is, to me, that's really the government just getting out of the way of journalism in this country and allowing us to issue tax receipts for something that deserves a tax receipt. And so I see that as a very positive move in the right direction. We are still waiting. It has been a lengthy process, but when we created the Narwhal 2 years ago, we never expected to get any kind of government support. So it's all gravy for us, from the local journalism initiative to the QCJO status to RJO status. These are all things that are, our budget has tripled in the 2 years since we started. We now have 10 full-time journalists and Canada's largest environment bureau. And so, that model is working for us, and the pandemic, if anything, has just, solidified the need for high quality journalism and trusting and engaging relationships with your readers. And that's that's been working out pretty well for us so far.
Great. Thanks a lot, Emma. You got a good job of getting all the alphabet soup acronyms there. That's good. Ed, floor is yours.
Okay, I unmuted before everyone said unmute. This is a triumphant day for me. Two things off the top, Brent. First of all, I was on the board of directors of Carleton, but more importantly, I am one of those BJ grads from Carleton, which really helped make a great life for me, a fun life for me. So I am forever grateful to Carleton. And John Honderich is a bona fide journalist, and I'm very grateful to him as well for his support over the years, and his support for journalism, particularly. So let me start with the question of advertising money. Let me just start with the obvious statement that journalism doesn't just matter now. Journalism always matters. You don't really know when journalism is going to matter. That's one of its great beauties. You're on patrol, and when things go amiss, journalism is there. I had someone who's very active and prominent in the climate movement say to me about 1.5 years ago that he thought the disinformation issue was more important than the climate issue. And I was kind of a bit taken aback by that. And he said, well, look, we can't have a good debate and a good discussion about climate if people can't trust the information they get in the media. We need a base of facts that are shared in society in order for democracy to work, and then in order to take action on climate. So I think that's an instructive thought as we go into this. Others have talked about the hit that's occurring in financial terms. I guess I would just add that in 2008, when the recession hit, the combined daily newspaper revenue from advertising was a little over $2.5 billion. And it immediately fell by about 15 to 20% between 2008, 2009. It never recovered that money. It stayed at a lower level for a few years and then went on its secular decline down. And I would be quite worried that what we are seeing now, which is from a base of probably about $800 million in 2019 for all of the dailies in Canada, down from about over $2.5 billion 12 years earlier, 10 years earlier. I expect we're going to be at 600 million or under 600 million this year, and that's not enough money to support journalism in this country. And I don't think that's coming back given the secular elements that we have, maybe a little bit of it, but if we have 20-25% hits, I suspect they're not coming back. So we documented this decline in the Shattered Mirror, which was published in January 2017. And I remember government officials, as we were going through it and walking them through our findings, they were astounded. Everybody knew the story in some ways, but to see it chart after chart, classified advertising, even subscriptions, other pieces of the revenue pie, just going down, and they've continued to go down. I'm happy that in 2019 the government decided that it would commit itself to a policy. I'm unhappy that it hasn't been able to deliver on that policy yet, and I just want to talk about that for a moment. I want to talk about in the context of again, what our research and other research has shown about the public's attitude towards journalism. So, very quickly, people have, sometimes we think that people don't trust journalism. People do trust journalism. They trust mainstream journalism. They trust journalism that goes out with reporters to find things out, verified by editors, et cetera, et cetera. And this is seen over and over again, trust levels in the 60s and even 70s percent, very high. They also want news when they feel they need news. We had a lot of people in focus groups say things to us like, I get a lot of my news off Facebook. And then they would pause and say, except if it's important to me. And the moderator would go, what do you do if it's important to you? And they would go, well, if it's important, I don't trust my friends and my family to know any more than I know. I don't trust people who don't go out and find things out. And they say, well, who do you rely on? And then they start naming local news organizations. They start naming national TV anchors. They start naming columnists with whom they're familiar. They care about this. I kind of concluded they want a fire department of news. They just don't want to have to encounter it or pay for it every day, but they do want it there when they need it, like now. They're not willing to pay, and Colette's work and research with Reuters, shows, I think, pretty much year after year, you can correct me, Colette, if this isn't up to date, but that about 9% of Canadians say they're willing to pay for digital news. And
It's 13 now.
we're 13, excellent, it's good.
It was the biggest jump this year before
Yeah.
the pandemic.
Okay, and some of that goes outside the country. Some of that goes to NewYorkTimes.com and other places as well. So not all of that is news by Canadians for Canadians. People are also, all the research shows, they're very nervous about the concept of government paying for news, supporting news organizations. To them, they have this block that one can understand, and it comes down basically to they so respect the function, the accountability function that journalism does, that they don't want that in any way compromised by government getting involved in it. Now, if you ask them in a focus group, well, what about the CBC? They look at their shoes, they don't want to have to square that circle. It's not incumbent upon them to, figure out every angle, but they are uncomfortable with that. So we decided in our work, we said, okay, the market is not going to support news adequately. This was in 2017. So where does money come from? And we sort of felt there's three places money can come from. One would be from large pools of wealth, whether these were benevolent billionaires or whether these are foundations and charities. Now, the problem with benevolent billionaires is the words don't always go together. And, you can see it's even in the States. John Henry and the Boston Globe may be a benevolent billionaire, but Sheldon Adelson in Las Vegas is not a benevolent billionaire. Simply put, Canada doesn't have a lot of billionaires and it doesn't have a lot of benevolent ones. And I suppose you can say the Thompsons are benevolent billionaires, but they're already invested in the news business, so they're not going. Foundations, probably not enough money to be material for the problems at hand, but let's get on with the philanthropic promises that were existed in there. Emma was telling us that she's applied. Time to get this thing going. This was a great victory to get journalism to count as a basis for charity. This kind of thing happens every 10 years. The last time it happened was amateur sport around the Vancouver Olympics was added in as a basis for charity. So, let's get on with it. The other pieces of that $595 million package, also same thing, the labor tax credit is a very good idea. I'd say it's an idea that after the Shattered Mirror, we did a workshop. John was part of it. We had labor unions, we had publishers of all sorts, digital, print-based, et cetera. And we've said the basic problem is it's not enough, we're losing our journalists. And that's what we have to correct for. And the labor tax credit's a pretty good policy because it's very neutral, it's very transparent, you can plan for it, it's predictable. There's some flaws in how the design was made, but I won't go into those now, and it's at the margin in a sense. But let's pay out 2019, let's pay out 2020. Most of the assertion whether you count as a journalistic organization or not is pretty easy. At the borders, there's going to be some difficult management, but I think we know the Toronto Star and the Globe and Mail and the Regina Leader Post, where I once worked, and many other places. They're journalistic. Let's just get on and let's actually prepay 2020 because liquidity is a problem for these companies. And finally, subscription tax credit, 15% is not enough to have any impact. So let's just make it 50% and get over with it. It will cost a little bit more money, but the government's been sitting on that money anyhow. The final thing I'd say, last thing, Brent, and I wanted to wait till Kevin got here so he can shoot me down on this in a moment afterwards. The number one recommendation of the Shattered Mirror, when you boil it down, and I wish in retrospect I had expressed it better than I did, and Colette was part of our research team, so she should have caught this. Your fault, Colette. The basic recommendation was that because people are skeptical of government being involved, that it would be better to have a transfer from distributors to producers. We have a history of that in this country in the cable levy. 5% of revenues from cable and satellite companies go into a production fund. In this case, I would finance the labor tax credit in that manner. Take it from digital ad sales, take a percentage of digital ad sales. Do not target Google and Facebook. There should be a principle-based system, but organizations that sell digital advertising and do not reinvest in Canadian journalism should be subject to a levy that will then be distributed in such a manner as the cable fund has been distributed for several decades. I'll end there without going to Australian friends.
Thanks, Ed. I'm sure that'll come up though at some point. I'm glad to see that Kevin's joined us. Thank you very much, Kevin. And apologies for the technical snafus, but glad to have you. And the floor is yours for 5 minutes.
Sure, thanks. Actually, thanks, Brent, for getting me out of wherever other dimension I was in. I was actually listening to most of it though, so I could hear most of the discussion. So thank you very much. Merci beaucoup. C'est un plaisir d'être ici avec vous pour célébrer le 75e anniversaire de l'école de journalisme at Carleton. And so it's really great to be here. And thank you to Alan for the invitation and for Brent as well. The celebration that we're marking today is happening in the midst of a global pandemic, as we've all discussed already, and that has been challenging, certainly, I think, for everyone. But I know, in talking to many colleagues in the news business, including folks like John Hines and Bob Cox and Philip Crawley, I know that it is particularly challenging for those in the news business, and not all, and I take Emma's point, but certainly I think when we think about the traditional news organizations, I think many of them have been challenged also at this time in a very particular way. And specifically, I've heard that COVID has been really an accelerant for the trend lines we've seen in the past, I'd say 20 years, as consumer behavior and advertising has moved from print to digital. And I think we have tried at Facebook to try to help in a few different ways. And so, with respect to the COVID response specifically, we made an announcement earlier this year of $100 million in investments across the globe for news publishers. We provided $1 million in grants to local news outlets, including 81 publications that received these grants in Canada. And we also provided an additional $1 million to the International Fact-Checking Network run out of Poynter for fact checkers that were looking specifically at fact-checking COVID misinformation. And that is, of course, over and above the $9 million we have invested in Canada, specifically over the past 3 years. And some of the things that has included are things like our accelerator programs and other kind of specialized programs for how to increase subscriptions, increase, direct, sort of marketing efforts. And I think the Narwhal has been part of one of those programs. My understanding is to very good effect. Creation of partnerships with universities like Ryerson to create the Digital News Innovation Challenge, and 2 graduates of that program I think are actually doing particularly well, the GIST and the Sprawl out in Calgary. and investments in other kind of digital news kind of incubators like IndieGraph, run by Aaron Miller, that of course houses The Discourse, but also things like La Converse and Indigenews. And most recently, and I'm really proud of this one, is our partnership with the Canadian Press. And of course, we've invested $1 million with CP to create 8 new positions for the year to cover local news across the country, including, for what I understand from Malcolm and Philip, the first position based out of Iqaluit in Nunavut. And that's a first for CP, and we're really, I'm personally very delighted to be part of that. So look, it's been, in this sort of difficult time, it has actually been quite personally rewarding for me to help create some of these programs and partnerships. And I think we want to do more, and we will do more. But I would say, and maybe this, gets to a bit sort of what Ed is alluding to, but I do have to say that for me, and I think for my colleagues, the recent debate in Canada about the relationship between publishers and platforms, I would say, has been somewhat disappointing. I've always seen Facebook, as I've tried to indicate here, as a constructive player in this, not only in terms of the investments that we've made, but also in the value that the platform itself provides to publishers. And we can get into the specifics later, but I do think that there are many different ways to continue to support news. I think Ed has alluded to some of them, but I think we need to be talking more together, and we need to be working more closely together and in constructive ways. And I have to admit, I don't think I've seen that. And that's not to any of you here, because you are not in that role currently, but I think that's something that we have to do, because this is bigger than the solution, or the solve is going to be bigger than any one company, and it's also going to be bigger than any one particular vector. So we do need to work collaboratively, and I look forward to discussing with colleagues what that can look like.
Thanks very much, Kevin. I appreciate it. So we'll now enter, we've heard from everyone, opening statements. I just want to shift in really briefly to a response round where the different panelists can have an opportunity to respond to comments that were made by any one of the colleagues on the panel. I'm going to do the same order that we spoke in the first time, so I'm going to go to John Hondrick first.
I'd like to echo the comments that Ed made about the advertising decline, what our experience has been, and quite frankly, what we expect going forward. Ed is quite correct that after the 2008-9 crash and all, advertising revenue declined dramatically. It's almost part of the old adage that once it goes away, they somehow forget about you. They may find other ways to advertise, and often you don't get those advertisers coming back. So I think we're expecting probably the same phenomenon to occur this time, that the declines, and I think Colette is quite correct, that the traditional news media, particularly who still with print products, have suffered some of the greatest declines, that a lot of that advertising is gone and not to come back, certainly not in the print product. So all that says is that the financial crisis, the financial strains that the industry broadly is facing has been exacerbated. And the situation, when we say the business case was, for them is done anyway, all that has made it worse. And so if any or others are going to be able to survive, it's going to have aid coming in quite quickly, because the numbers speak for themselves, and it's not a pretty picture.
Great, thank you. Colette Bryn, please.
Yes, well, there could be several points, but I'll try to keep it to one. I just had an additional thought about news ecosystems, and it's not specifically about traditional versus digital or new startup media, but there is a concern for me about the kind of support that we bring in and how these measures of support are sustaining not just existing news companies, but also the renewal of the news ecosystem. So, you know, that was actually a concern during the Shattered Mirror consultations. You know, are we looking to sustain, and even some of the resistance to government aid is, are we just supporting broken business models and just kind of, you know, keeping them on life support as opposed to supporting companies that are just getting started and have maybe a more promising future. And part of, I don't want to get too much into the work of the CRA and the advisory board, which is confidential, but one of the issues that I'm struggling with is, you know, the kind of general interest news that we're supposed to be, that this program is designed to support, and more specialized areas, such as the narwhal. You know, I mean, we can talk about that case since it has been approved. That is, you know, in a sense, a specialty publication because it's not doing kind of, you know, City Hall and all the kind of courts and all the kinds of traditional news beats that we consider to be journalism, but it is covering the natural world. To me, that's a pretty big beat, and through all these different angles. And there were a couple, and this is something that came up a lot in the new media initiatives, or the new applicants that were specialized, but in a different way than a traditional newspaper. But it's kind of a new thought as opposed to a response.
Yeah, no, but it rethinks the idea of what a beat looks like, or, you know, I think that we're seeing a lot more specialization, and that's what's turning, you know, at least some profitability. So I think that's a good point. Yeah. Emma, would you like to speak to that or anything else?
Sure. Yeah, I'll speak to that a little bit. I mean, just in terms of, yeah, I mean, when a beat is so large, like I often say, you know, the narwhal is like the environment section of the newspaper, except there isn't one of those. So it's pretty mainstream. It's pretty general interest. You know, it's not, I kind of try to avoid the word niche, you know, although we are specialized, you know, we're experts on that topic, but we're by no means niche. You know, we look to be a site that, you know, any Canadian could come to and read for their environmental news. You know, one thing that kind of occurred to me, I mean, I agree with so much of what everybody has said, and it's, you know, a really troubling situation for, you know, different models of media. I do think we have to be careful about kind of prejudging the potential for philanthropic support for journalism in Canada by looking at the fact that there hasn't been much. Well, there hasn't been much because it hasn't really been allowed. There hasn't been an avenue for that. No, you know, we aren't going to likely have the Knight Foundation or some of, you know, the large journalistic foundations, you know, in the US that provide massive amounts of support. But I don't think that means that it's not material. When you look at, you know, the way that a digital news model can be built these days, you know, what organizations really need is runway funding to get the plane off the ground, to build the model, and to create the kind of perpetual motion machine where if you have an audience and you're doing good work, you're going to be able to convert a certain number of those into paying members or subscribers. And so, you know, it's not like we need a philanthropic sector that can prop up all of Canadian journalism, but what we do need is a philanthropic sector that will help fund innovation in journalism. And I personally feel quite hopeful that that will happen, that there are many Canadian foundations that have, you know, within their purview, you know, issues of democracy, for instance, which are very related to journalism. And so, yeah, well, I don't think it's going to be, you know, the, you know, panacea for Canadian journalism. I think it's too soon to say that it's not going to make a material impact.
That's a good point. That's a very good point. Ed, I think you would have some thoughts on that or something else.
Yeah, I just respond to two comments that were made to agree with them. One, you know, Paulette's point that the media model is different and policy needs to reflect that difference. You know, post the Shattered Mirror, we did a couple of reports. One of them was called something along the lines of what journalism can learn from the Saskatchewan Roughriders. And what journalism could learn from the Saskatchewan Roughriders was a business that was going bankrupt around the turn of the century and was turned into a community-based not-for-profit, and was able to get an entire new lease on life. And I'm all for profit organizations, and many of the startups are for profit. National Observer is for profit. The Logic is for profit. I'm also all for not-for-profit organizations. I think the thing is that we're going to have a whole bunch of different kinds of models that are emerging. Mostly, to Colette's point, a lot of them are going to be smaller than what I'm accustomed to. I also really like large newsrooms. I like large newsrooms because they have the capacity to waste talent for a year or two without knowing if they're getting a payoff. Having said that, that's not the world that we're moving to. We're moving to a world of more newsrooms and smaller newsrooms, and I think policy hasn't caught up with that adequately yet. The problem with the government's package is it's really not fully, if you look at it and go through it, it doesn't meet the principles of being business model neutral and platform neutral adequately. It has more work still to be done there. My second point would be on Kevin's comment that the solution is bigger than any one company. I couldn't agree more. You know, if what we don't want is a future in which journalism is dependent on the goodwill of other private sector actors for its wherewithal. If this is a public good, and it is a public good, then public policy needs to solve this problem and at the core of the problem. So Google has announced a huge fund in a bunch of countries, and it selected a couple of news organizations to support in Canada. I don't think the future of news should be decided by who Google thinks is worthy of the future of news. I think we need a much more neutral approach that is supported by public policy.
Thanks, Ed. That's great. Kevin, last voice on this round.
Sure. I just echo the same thing. I think that I've heard from many people on one score, which is like, I think digital news innovation is key. And I mean, and some of you will know, Ed will know, you know, as of, you know, I think it's 2017, we've been on this journey. So certainly in the partnership with Janice and the gang at Ryerson, as well as the digital media zone of Abdullah, that is really, you know, I think one key pillar of this, right? It's just sort of figure out what the future of news can look like on the internet. And there are incredible, you know, entrepreneurs and practitioners like Emma who are kind of pioneering that. And I think that's, you know, I think that's a big piece of the puzzle. On the point that Emma made about, you know, philanthropy in this country, I mean, it's interesting. I mean, I don't want to say too much, but I mean, Brent, I mean, you and I were talking about this, and I think both of us found this surprising. I was on a call recently with folks from the McConnell Foundation. They bring together interested parties who want to support news. And I had not talked to them about sort of our work with Canadian Press. But we started the call and they declared us, Facebook in Canada, to be the top independent private funder or supporter of news in Canada. And I was like, well, that doesn't sound right. But then we talked about it and I was like, oh, maybe that is right. And I agree. I think we should do more. I have some ideas about that I'd like to sort of noodle around, maybe with colleagues, you know, afterwards. But I do think there is something in the space of how can we catalyze Canadians and get more Canadians to pay for news and value news. I think there's something there. I mean, you know, some of us can catalyze that, but I think, you know, at the end of the day, you want people to find it perfectly normal to pay for news, like I did, like I still do, you know, like, you know, I still have my you'll be happy, Ed, right? I still have my print Globe and Mail every day delivered to my door. We need more people doing that, whether it be print or digital. So how do we do that? And I think I have some ideas, but I do think we need to figure out how to work together to sort of crack that nut, because I think it's a really hard one. The last one, just on advertising transfers. I mean, look, obviously I'm going to have to say this just because, from where I sit, I just think, like advertising is a model that has worked well in the past in print. It currently works well online, but but for example, Emma, let's say, doesn't rely on that. And there are other publications that are largely focused on subscription revenue as the future. So I'm not sure that building a system that assumes that advertising is should always or should be an important underpinning of the internet or of news or any other business is something that's going to necessarily transcend or sort of stand the test of time. So I agree with Ed, the answer is public policy, but we have to sort of think things through that are technology neutral, that are undergirded, I think, by principles that are going to stand the test of time and that are going to be applicable irrespective of sort of what perspective you come at it from. Those are very important kind of foundational things for any kind of frameworks. And so I would think we would want to think through what those things are, because I don't think we're there yet.
Mm-hmm. That's interesting. So I think a lot about, that the idea that, and I've heard from all of you now, that says, that media policy hasn't kept up with reality, and that I think that that's something that everybody can agree on. I'd like to sort of segment it though into two sections. I'd like to talk about what the government is proposing to do, and then what kind of relationship can be sketched out with tech companies like Facebook and Google. So the first thing I'm sort of thinking about is the $595 million package that the federal government has put forward. I'd be interested to know what you guys think. Is that now currently fit to purpose, actually, based on the realities in a post-pandemic or during this pandemic? Is that actually enough, or hitting the right notes in order to support a strong news ecosystem in Canada?
I would go back to actually Ed's question about, because I'm actually part of that process. So I don't, I can't speak for the CRA or of course for the minister, but in terms of the aid not being platform neutral, I'm not sure what you meant by that, because we've actually already supported and given the green light to quite a few digital news sources. So I'm not sure what you were looking at in the policy that was problematic.
Well, some of what I was looking at has been corrected recently, has been addressed recently, including the written media aspect of things. So neutral would be podcasts are a good means of.
That's for the subscription part. That's for the subscription, not for the labor credit. Yeah.
And then even something as simple in business model neutrality as the two employees working a minimum of, I think it's 26 weeks a year of, 5 weeks a year of 26 hours, I think it was. And I can understand why the government would want to have some minimum threshold. I can understand that very well, that I shouldn't just go down to the basement and start up my news organization, government support. But if they just said, for instance, okay, we want 2,080 hours, which is I think what that would equal, and you can decide if you want to have 10 people doing 208 hours, or you want to have 2 people doing, because different people have different models with freelancers and others, that would be kind of getting out of the way. As I said, many of these points, Colette, are at the margin, so I don't want to make too much about them. Okay.
Yeah, and we don't want to get too much into policy detail because we'll lose all our participants.
You're already leaving. No, I'm kidding. Does anybody else have any thoughts about, whether the program now, are there things that are missing, that have come to light, do you think, in the in light of the pandemic? I got John and then Emma.
I'll go back to your more fundamental question, is it enough? I don't think from the beginning, the response of the major media companies was this was going to help, but it wasn't going to, in fact, allow for survival. On the issue of philanthropy and the foundations, you know, it's interesting, brought up the McConnell Foundation, whose monies came from the Great Montreal Star, and they've done pathetically little, I would say, in the whole area of journalism. Pathetically little. There is no tradition of philanthropy in this country, and that's largely been because people can't get a slip for it. So we're starting from scratch. It is interesting. You can look to the States because they changed their rules back in the late 90s for philanthropy, and it's taken quite a while. But at least they've now had some foundations and people like Bill Gates, et cetera, who viewed this as being important. I haven't seen any of that in Canada, or very little.
Make a good point. Emma.
Yeah, I mean, to follow on that, I was gonna speak to the government policies, but now I'll follow on that a little bit too. It has been pathetically little because, as you say, there hasn't been the tax receipt. So it's like we've been just shutting that off. At the same time, you know, 70% of our support comes from philanthropic foundations, and you know, our reader support is the largest single chunk of our pie, as a full 30%. But you know, we're getting money from over 10 different foundations, I would say. But you know, I know that we're a small example. It's like you can't look at the Narwhal and be like, yes, you know, just do more of that. That's going to solve Canadians' journalism problems. Obviously, it's not. But maybe many models like the Narwhal would be a significant part of the solution. You know, a newsroom of 10 or 20 people is not insignificant when you get them working a beat. But back to the government policy end of things, I mean, I actually think the government did a pretty good job designing those policies and looking at, you know, who should be in and who should be out, and having some kind of minimum requirements. And I could see they were looking to the US and some of the, you know, requirements around funding transparency, for instance, you know, disclosing your donors, editorial independence, not receiving more than 20% of funding from a single source. I think those are all really smart moves in terms of the registered journalism organization status. My kind of key beef is probably around the local journalism initiative, which I think did a very rapid job of getting reporters out into, you know, communities across the country. However, the story quota issue, you know, they're looking for upwards of 7 stories a week now, I think, from a single reporter. And, you know, while I know that is achievable in a straight news environment, you know, for someone like the Narwhal, we're about helping our readers make sense of the world, providing context. We think readers want better, not more. And just like blasting people with stories, you know, that somebody can turn around in 3 hours from a press release doesn't jive with our model. That's not how we're gonna keep our readers around and paying for journalism. So I do hope that, you know, on the local journalism initiative, there'll be a little bit more wiggle room around that story quota moving forward.
That's interesting. So Emma, can I just back up to one thing that you said, because I know you're involved with like Institute for Nonprofit News in the States. And so you're in that sort of that sphere of thinking. What is it that foundations, because you mentioned there's quite a few that are interested, what is it, the so-called value proposition, for lack of a better description, that they find interesting about the Narwhal? And maybe, you know, is there a way to sort of forecast that onto what might be coming after the pandemic?
Yeah, I mean, I think that a lot of foundations are interested in all sorts of, you know, public good, you know, whether that's empowering people to engage in their democracy, whether it's, you know, issues of environmental democracy, and just straight information needs of communities. And so, you know, the Narwhal has been able to make a compelling case that there are gaps in the information needs in the coverage of these topics. And, you know, these foundations are really interested in filling in those gaps and, you know, reaching an audience of people who really care about these issues, essentially. And I think that could be replicated on all number of issues, whether, you know, total general interest news or other, you know, specific topics. You know, there's foundations of every every, shade in Canada interested in various different things. And so, yeah, I do think that there's potential there, but, yeah, is it gonna, save the Globe and Mail if the business model isn't working otherwise? Probably not. But can it assist in an evolving business model? I think that it can.
Right. Thanks. Thank you. Ed, I want to go to you, and then I'll ask Kevin about some of the tech platforms in the cooperation. So go ahead.
Yeah, I just want to, first off, I feel honor bound to come to the defense of the McConnell Foundation, who aren't here themselves. Particularly since yesterday I was on a different panel and was praising the McConnell Foundation. So I want to be consistent. I'm not sure why John picks on McConnell particularly. It might be a Toronto-Montreal thing. I don't know. Atkinson certainly has done a good job. When we were looking to finance the Shattered Mirror, we decided that we would go to 3 foundations that had made their money off of newspapers, and that was McConnell, Atkinson, and Max Bell, and they all supported the research that we did. And so I find, foundations generally in Canada haven't done a lot. Then again, the rules still are not completely in place to enable that. And then again, we don't have really truly wealthy foundations. We don't have a Bill Gates. We don't have fortunes of $50 billion sitting in foundations. And McConnell seems to have done some decent work relative to the foundation, particularly in trying to capacity build, trying to bring other foundations to understand journalism. And I just say one other thing, because somebody mentioned that the labor tax credit's a pretty good model, and I agree. I think it is a very good model. I'm looking at, so I've been looking at some of the stuff that Australia is proposing, and there's been a lot of attention, obviously, to the forced negotiation around copyrighted material, which, by the way, is not something that I suspect is going to work out very well as a policy. But Australia is also really following the Canadian model on something they call PIJ, public interest journalism. And they're putting forward tax concessions or incentives, quote, designed to lower the cost of employing journalists, and so encourage effort devoted to activities that will generate public benefits. This is right out of our labor tax credit, and I think Canada should be happy that it's a model. And obviously, countries should be drawing off the best of each other, but we have something to offer in this regard.
Okay, interesting. Kevin, I wanted to ask you, you mentioned about, having more constructive dialogues with publishers and between, tech platforms. Could you explain a little bit more about maybe what that looks like in practice?
Well, I mean, I don't have, a sort of a process in mind. I think in almost every other space, in the work that I do, so everything from election integrity to civic engagement to empowerment and supporting networks of activists to misinformation, on all those fronts, we have very rich and substantive discussions with the entire ecosystem, right? Like NGOs, thought leaders, civil society, academics. We just haven't had that with publishers. I have to tell you, the first time that I was aware that there was, distress was when I saw, because I still subscribe to the Globe and Mail in print, was when I saw on the weekend back in May that one-page ad. And I was like, this is interesting. And I think my first question was, why didn't anybody call us? So I don't think it's actually that complicated. It's this idea that, Alan would reach out to me following his appointment and saying, you should come talk about the stuff you're doing. I really appreciate that. It's the idea that John Fraser would reach out and say, hey, I like what you're doing. We should talk. Colette, I invited you for morning tea in Quebec City when I was visiting a few years ago. I mean, that's kind of what we need to do. And it strikes me that it's incredible that there's been no discussion. And I'm just telling you that straight up. And so it seems like the posture has been adopted pretty, very clearly about where, certain organizations feel things should go. But there actually is kind of like, there hasn't been any, there's been no discussion underpinning any of that, which seems to me, I think anybody would find that surprising and curious.
Yeah. I wanted to ask you too about, I mean, today, Media Canada released a call for the federal government to, basically model a policy on the Australian model. And I just wanted to get your thoughts because it's sort of a breaking news, news du jour kind of thing. I wanted to get your thoughts on, what you think that will do, and especially how it will impact this kind of dialogue.
Yeah, well, look, so I have to be honest, I haven't read the report because I was actually, it's Small Business Week as well this week. And so I was with some small businesses, working with them on how they can, grow their businesses during COVID. But I did read the news release because someone sent it to me. And I have to admit, and again, I haven't read the details, but I have to admit that in reading the news release, if the news release accurately describes what's in the report, I didn't recognize Facebook in that news release. They made some claims which I don't think map in any way back to our products, and what the relationship between publishers and platforms are, at least with respect to Facebook. I can't speak for others, but I have to tell you, like, when I read that, I actually pinged my colleague and asked them, like, what do you think this refers to? And so I'm a bit puzzled, and I can be very specific if you like. I mean,
yeah, no, I was just wondering what section you're thinking. Or
well, there's a whole section about, like, I think the advertising, where they made reference to how we take most of the revenue, even on ads that are served on their sites. And I have to tell you, we have an advertising system called Audience Network, but Audience Network doesn't work for desktop. It only works for apps. And not only that, but organizations, the website, apps or publishing apps, if publishers have apps, for those who do, they take the majority of the revenue. So it's actually completely the opposite of what's being claimed in the news release. I don't really know why. It might be an issue of they got us confused with some other platform, right? That's possible. But I can tell you, that it doesn't describe Facebook, and it doesn't describe how Audience Network works with Facebook. And so I was very puzzled by it.
Okay. John, as a former publisher, have you had a chance to read the report yet?
No, I haven't read that report, but I mean, I think the studies and I know the Australian example, and they specifically looked at Facebook and Google. They figured out exactly how much ad revenue was taken out of the country, and they compared that to the amount of taxes that was paid in Australia. And the gap was huge. That's the study that was done quite a while ago and is the basis for a lot of their report. So, and I think similar studies, I think a study like that should be done here as well to find out the gap. I mean, I think the facts are pretty clear. I'd like to say something to Ed as well about the McConnell Foundation. Ed, the McConnell Foundation is the largest in the country.
John, I think you're breaking up there.
$5,000 grant for you to do it. I think you're.
This is very important.
We're all
I know
frozen.
This is very important. I'm trying to decode.
Are other people finding John?
Yes, frozen.
Yeah,
it's not just me. Okay.
Can I respond to what you said while we wait for John?
Sure, Kevin, go ahead, please.
I mean, look, I have to tell you, and it's kind of actually to my regret, John and I have never really spoken, because I suspect we'd get along if we had a chance to have a private conversation. But I have to tell you, I sincerely believe that. But I have to tell you, I mean, the way, like, I mean, look, and Michael Geist has written a very interesting blog on this, and you can look it up at michaelgeist.ca. He looks at actually Toronto Star specifically, but if you look at the way, and again, I'm not here to explain how the entire internet works. I can only speak to the Facebook portion, right? So that's unfortunately kind of, I only get, like, you know, part of the loaf here. But I have to tell you, right, the way publisher content gets onto Facebook is with publishers putting things on Facebook, right? And so we actually don't control that. We have actually the system doesn't take stuff and put it into newsfeed. Publishers put things onto newsfeed. And so for us, I think, you know, it's with Australia, that is a very, like that's just, those are just the facts of how the mechanics of Facebook works. And so a framework that is not based on those facts, obviously going to be very hard for us to be able to bridge. Now, I agree with John, though. I think the broader point, I mean, there's two issues here, right? Like, again, what's the relationship between publishers and platforms? That's one thing. And then there's another thing, which is tax. And I think it's totally appropriate for there to be taxes that are going to address the concerns that have been flagged, right? I mean, should the government collect and remit the sales tax and force us to collect and remit the sales tax, create rules for that? I think that's very normal, right? Like, that's very normal to want to do that. And we would never oppose that. Should the government, should a particular government based in a particular country like Canada want to have a greater share of revenue from multinational digital companies? I think that's totally, I can totally understand that logic. There is, and it's not a Facebook or a Shopify or a Google that's resisting that, right? There are broad international rules since the 1920s that undergird the way that the international tax system works. There's a process through the OECD that's trying to reform that. And I think, and we do not at all oppose that. I think, in fact, we support that process, and we fully appreciate that at the end of that process, we are likely to pay more taxes in Canada and probably net at the end more taxes globally. We think that's perfectly, it's a perfectly legitimate and appropriate outcome. But we do need to have kind of rules that are consistent for everybody. And I think that's been sort of the point. So I actually would think, from a public policy standpoint, we want to break apart. It's not like the tax policy is one thing. The kind of the rules or the way in which publishers and platforms work together, and what the relationship is and what the mechanics are in terms of how things get onto systems and how they get distributed and where the value lies, that's a very different proposition. Right. And I would resist the urge to conflate the two.
So sorry,
I would like Kevin,
moderator, or you're getting cut off. Don't worry, this is like practice for the debate tonight. No, go ahead.
I just want to encourage Kevin to run for Parliament on a platform of taxing digital giants. That's.
I think we already have every company, every party running on that. I thought.
So I want to go to I have, John, I want to get your final thoughts on this. I know you had something you were saying also to resolve the McConnell Foundation and this Toronto-Montreal rivalry, which will probably never end. But I also then want to go to a question on the discussion board. So if you can take 30 seconds and finish up the thought that you were sharing with us before.
Did it not go through?
It didn't, unfortunately. No, we got slivers of it only.
Well, I just wanted to say to Ed, the McConnell Foundation is the largest foundation in Canada. You can look totally at the amount it's had. It has those wonderful picnics on an island in the St. Lawrence River where people scratch their foreheads and wonder about the future. But they've done not much at all, as have most foundations. And if giving you $5,000 to do some research for the Shattered Mirror counts as a big contribution, I think your standards are lower than they should be. That's my only point.
That's a good
Okay,
point.
I'm not going to spend time on an argument here, but they've been much more supportive of a variety of folks than 5,000. But and I think they go to Scratch Heads in Muskoka.
Okay, that's okay. I have never been there, so I can't decide this argument, but I would gladly accept an invitation at some point. I want to just go to the question board here. We have a question about the role of universities and other research organizations in terms of forming partnerships to provide more accurate and in-depth coverage of issues. I know, for example, that there's the Institute for Investigative Journalism at Concordia. I just read today that Rob Cribb is starting something similar, affiliated with the Monk School at the U of T. I wanted to go to Colette as the sort of the resident academic university person here to sort of get her thoughts on how you see this role of universities playing in here.
Well, the examples you mentioned, I mean, there are journalism schools that are already collaborating and doing this kind of maybe investigative or data work with newsrooms. The problem with universities is that they tend to have their own interests and to be very focused on whatever serves the institution or, you know, promotes the research that's being done at the institution. So something that's been very successful, I think, is The Conversation, which is actually was a university-based initiative in Canada by colleagues at UBC. But when you're talking about partnering with specific newsrooms, I had a research center. We do work with Radio-Canada and Le Devoir and different media organizations, but we always struggle with the issue is which one do we get married to? You know, we'd rather work with a broad, you know, with the media ecosystem more generally and associations and that kind of thing, rather than partner with one specific organization. So that's also a challenge. But for sure, and what we're seeing a lot of in the research world is actually research centers getting funding to create news websites on climate, on whatever issues, and they actually hire what they call journalists, and they do their own kind of reporting. So we're seeing kind of this fragmentation of the media ecosystem, and these are positive contributions, but I agree with what Ed said earlier about it's important to have these big newsrooms that cover like a wide range of issues and topics and beats.
I think it's interesting. John, go ahead. Sorry.
I was just going to say to at the Star, we've also had for about the last 3 or 4 years a program, dare I say, with Ryerson, but obviously in the same city as we are. And investigative reporters, Rob Cribb has been at the forefront, and they've actually done some very significant work that in fact has won awards, and it has been working with the journalism students at Ryerson, but also some input from across the country. And so far it's worked extremely well. It's not large, but it's been significant.
I think it's, if nobody has any further thoughts on that, I'd be interested to know what people think about the idea of the role of the university or a post-secondary institution as helping to facilitate some of the public engagement or to explain, you know, why news matters, some of the democratic piece around that. I think, you know, Emma, as you said, and others, you know, and Colette as well, you know, we're focusing.
That's basically my whole job.
Well, good. I'm glad somebody's doing it. But like, how do we go about priming the audience to help them understand? You know, in the last session that I sat in on, you know, Chris Waddell had a pie chart that shows, you know, that there's, well, you said earlier, I think you said 13%, which is higher. I think it was 9 a couple of years ago, if I'm not mistaken. But how do you go about priming the audience for them to understand, you know, the importance of news and why bother paying for it when they've had it for free since the dawn of time?
Well, since the late 1990s.
Yeah, right.
I remember. Well, I mean, if I may, I mean, Brent, on that one, I think that's sort of one of the points I wanted to, that I did bring up earlier, and I think it's important for us to kind of pursue after this, is we do need to all get together. I mean, I feel like I've kind of tried to, you know, certainly on my end. I mean, we've talked to Ryerson. I very much enjoy the time that I've had in terms of conversations with Chris and Susan, Chris Waddell and Chris Dornan and Susan de Carleton. It's been great. I mean, we've tried to talk to some other journalism schools. I think with less success, but we should do more, and it should be and maybe they're an appropriate neutral party to convene these sorts of things, and why stop at J schools? We should do it at the public policy schools too, right? Everybody should come together and try to figure out, well, what's the right way to think about this? We're all Canadian. We care about this as an important element of our democracy. We also, I don't think, are naive. And what I heard from everybody was, look, things are going to change. Things are going to look different. What does that different look like? Emma's actually charting the course herself as to what the future could look like. We need to come to the table with that kind of framework and that kind of mindset and figure out what we can do together. The McConnell Foundation, clearly, despite what has been said, they are trying to do a bit of that. I don't know if they're talking to universities too, but I think we should all get together and figure out what we can do collectively, because it is a collective concern. We care about this because we're Canadian.
Mm-hmm. Ed or Colette, do you have thoughts on the role public policy schools, universities could play in this shaping the conversation? Yeah, you, Ed.
Oh, me. Okay. I'm sorry. I've been totally distracted. We're at this wonderful event that Carleton's put on, and I keep hearing these mentions about Ryerson, and I just figure the chair of the Ryerson Journalism School must be an absolute genius. That's all I can figure.
She really is.
I'm going to be in
There's no
trouble.
conflict of interest there at all.
No, not at all. I'm going to be in trouble at dinner because I didn't take notes of all those positive mentions. But I think it's important everybody knows that she is a Carleton journalism grad. So I think that's important to know. On the question, yes, everybody should be talking about the state of our democracy. And, this is obviously a foundational issue. Journalism is a major part of it. I always like to say that a broke press, and by that I mean financially broke press, can't be a sufficient free press, and it can't do the job that it needs to do for society. So I think everybody should be discussing that, and they should be discussing disinformation and hate online and the way that pollutes our civic discourse. These are, profoundly important issues. I say from a public policy forum point of view, we have a citizen assembly currently ongoing on these issues, particularly the issues of disinformation and hate and what to do about these. And we have a Canadian Commission on Democratic Expression that includes among its commissioners Beverly McLaughlin and Adam Dodek, the Dean of Law at University of Ottawa, and 5 others. A good group, and they're struggling and sweating to figure out how you deal with free speech and harms that are getting caused through the system. Particularly hate is their prime emphasis, but other harms, including disinformation as well. And
so are we.
There are a lot of people doing this work.
Indeed.
Kevin came and testified before them.
There's actually a lot of academic research being done on disinformation and online hate, and I don't see maybe enough connection with journalism being done there. It's like they're like separate spheres, and I can say that the McConnell Foundation, it's just kind of like an inside joke in this panel, is involved in those efforts as well. But the relationship between that and journalism and making people understand that if journalism disappears, that's kind of a big problem in terms of disinformation and misinformation, and that needs to be paid for. It's what we've been saying for years, that it's not free, right? Journalism is not free. It's not. It needs to be sustained.
So what kind of attitudinal shifts need to take place then? I mean, we've only got 5 minutes, but I want to get Emma in on this one because I think she's probably the best position to answer this one. You know, journalists are remarkable at telling the stories of other people, but we're awful at telling our own stories. You know, I was just looking at the Ryerson, sorry, Ed, I'm a Carleton grad too, but this is a Ryerson thing, JSource and the CAJ impact map. And I noticed that the latest numbers, we have 810 permanent layoffs since the beginning of the pandemic. So like, this is what's going on. But we're not, it's hard to communicate that. So how do you rewrite this story so that people understand better? Emma?
Well, I mean, I think with anything, the best way to communicate with people is to meet them where they're at, and take them where you want them to be. And in that sense, I think trying to tell people that they need to care about journalism is generally not the best approach. The way to get people to care about journalism is to do good journalism on issues they care about that hit close to home for them. And then to have a system in place where you're like, aha, you're here reading about this quarry in your neighborhood that's polluting your local stream. Great, would you like to subscribe to our newsletter? Awesome, okay, now you're in our newsletter. We're gonna give you a great welcome series. We're gonna tell you all about us. Oh, what do you know? You're gonna get a weekly newsletter. Now we're gonna report back to you on the impact of this story. Then we're gonna come to you and we're gonna say, you know what, we have this big idea to do this $15,000 investigation into this mine over here. Do you wanna support us to do that? And people do. So it's really, you know, you got to meet them somewhere. You have to have a funnel. So I'm talking the Facebook accelerator language here. I spent some time in the nonprofit world. Like this is, I think, you know, we need to look across the, you know, outside of our own sector, because, you know, the people we have on the bus who built the news industry on advertising, those aren't necessarily the same skills we need to build a new model for media. Which is really around, you know, working kind of a business funnel, meeting people where they're at. And ultimately, I mean, all of our organizations, you know, do really good journalism, and it's about being able to capture those readers and make a business case to them and make compelling appeals to them about the impact of your work.
Kevin, I see you got your hand up and you're nodding.
Oh, yeah, sorry. I could add something. I was had my hand up for something else, but I love the funnel language, because that's exactly, you know, I was lucky enough to spend some time on some of the accelerator programs we've run, and it's very fascinating stuff. I mean, I think Emma's right. I think there's a lot of things that we can port in when we think about the future of digital news. You know, we had Bob Cox in the Winnipeg Free Press as part of one of our accelerators, and I was down in California with him for one of the sessions. You know, he told me, he said, this is basically a mini MBA for publishers, for journalists. And I was like, oh, I hadn't thought of it that way, but you know, yeah, I mean, I guess this is about business tools, right, to help your business grow. And we should do more of that. And I'm totally, you know, I'd love to work on something like that as one piece of a much broader menu of things that we have to do to get this going the direction we want it to go. But I think, again, I come back to the point that I made, you know, earlier, is that I'm not entirely sure that, well, I don't think the adversarial nature of what I've read and what I've seen and what I've heard is terribly productive. We have to deal with a challenge that we all care about right now. And so we've got to work together on that. And I think that's very important. And if you, and if, I mean, again, I know you guys all feel the same, but if there are others who you talk to who feel like that's an important thing to do, then let's, you know how to find me. Let's get something going now, right? Because we can't wait. It's important. We got to get it right.
Great. Last question. I like to end on a positive note wherever possible, just so that everybody has something positive to take away from the session, and especially, Lord knows, in days like today, anything positive is something good to hold on to. We heard earlier today from Julie Pizzetti and the International Federation for Journalists, and the Tow Center, who have the report that they recently released. And one of the main things that they said is that the pandemic offers a really great opportunity to reimagine what journalism looks like in the future. If we could do like 15 seconds for each person going down the panel, what is one thing that you're encouraged by for the future of journalism? I'd start with Colette.
health and science journalism. In my experience in the pandemic has really been amazing, especially here, specifically here in Quebec. And there's actually a great appetite for that kind of news. And I'm hoping that it will grow in the years to come.
Thank you. Emma.
I'm really inspired by membership models, The Guardian internationally being a huge leader in that, and The Sprawl in Calgary doing awesome work.
Right on. Thank you. Ed.
I'm encouraged that people turn to journalism when things matter to them. And I don't think it's for them to solve how journalism will work. It's for us to solve how it will work for them, how we will make it work. And it won't happen without a public policy element to it.
Great. Kevin, please.
I think I'm optimistic about sort of some of the successes we're seeing. So, Emma talked about her success at Narwhal. We talked about the Sprawl. I think that's really encouraging. But it's not just the digital sort of startups. It's big players. Globe and Mail, if I believe what Philip has told me, is doing really well. And I think that's hope for all of us. John maybe disagrees or knows something I don't. But I think those are good things, and we should try to find ways to support more publications.
Great. John, you started us off. Let's bring us home.
I actually, what the pandemic has shown is once again, and this is just a variation of what Ed has said, once again, when there's a story that's really important, and as Emma brings it right home to what people care about, the first place people want to turn to is traditional media. And the response, and certainly from our company, the response that we've got is evidence of that when it comes to news that's important, that people depend on, rely on, traditional sources is still where they turn. And that's got to be the basis on which we should be able to build something.
Great. Thank you, all five of you. Wonderful debate, wonderful discussion, wonderful debate. Thank you all very much for your time and taking some time out of your afternoon or morning. Nope, it's still afternoon in BC, so you're okay, Emma. Thanks again. And on behalf of Carleton, thanks for doing this. I really appreciate it very much. And as a Carleton grad myself, I'm happy to declare no conflicts of interest in this whatsoever, but look forward to seeing you at other sessions over the next day and a half. So thanks a lot. Take care.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thank you,
Bye, everyone.
Brent. Happy birthday, Carleton.
Yeah.